Session, if you want to move closer towards the front so that we can all be a little closer together. We're not scary, I promise. All right, if you are in the session for trauma and weaving yoga and mindfulness into the classroom, you all should have gotten a piece of paper that says finding your ACE score. Pull that out first, and we're going to take about the next 2 minutes as everybody's getting settled. Take a look over it, and you can fill it out. We'll come back to it later. You don't have to if you don't want to, but it's a good learning opportunity. So take about the next 2 minutes to get yourself settled and start to work on that. That's your do now. What? Huh? Yeah. We'll spend about 1 more minute on that. No. We're good. Right now, and that's for after. 2 of each. All right, let's pause there so we can be mindful of our time together, and we'll come back to reflect on that. But first of all, thank you guys so much for being here. We are Project Peaceful Warriors, and we are an organization that provides trauma-informed yoga and mindfulness in schools in New Orleans. So we're here today to speak mostly to how to incorporate tools like yoga and mindfulness into the classroom, specifically for students that have experienced high levels of trauma. And that's who we are. So my name is Chelsea. I'm the founder and executive director of the organization. We're a nonprofit. I've been teaching kids yoga for about the past 7 years. I started in Charleston, South Carolina, working in Title I schools. And I worked there as part of my capstone project of my senior year. I went in to teach yoga classes to both elementary school and high school students. And then I moved to New Orleans and began teaching in charter schools there. And that's where I became very aware of the need for trauma-informed services. We have, the majority of our students have experienced high levels of trauma, and the training that I had wasn't quite what I needed to be able to meet them where they were. So that's how I really became involved with the trauma-informed perspective. I was also a classroom teacher and noticed that these students were not learning coping skills in the regular classroom setting, and this was something that could really support them and help them, not just in their learning and in the school environment, but how they took it out into the world afterwards.
My name's Chloe Kingery. I got my master's in psychology from College of Charleston and realized, my bachelor's from College of Charleston and realized there was nothing really I could do with that without a master's. So I found my way to New Orleans and got my master's in clinical mental health counseling at Loyola University. Outside of Project Peaceful Warriors, my 9-to-5 job is I am a clinician at the District Attorney's Office in Jefferson Parish as part of a juvenile justice reform in a juvenile diversion program. So our goal is to lower the rate of youth in our systems. Jefferson Parish, unfortunately, has the highest incarceration rate in the country, maybe even in the world. So we are part of that at the forefront of the justice reform. And so pretty much I have a caseload about 40 to 60 families at all times. And every single family I work with has lots and lots of trauma. So my interest in getting involved with Chelsea when she approached me was, I see this every single day, and how can I also be a part of Project Peaceful Warriors as the mental health consultant is my official title.
I'll do a little introduction each day. Just while we wait to get the next part set up, how many of you are classroom teachers? Awesome. How many of you work in schools that are Title I? And then how many of you have a background or some experience with trauma? Excellent. Okay. So Chloe's going to go more into the science behind trauma and its effects on the brain and in our students. I will then go into how it looks in the classroom, and then we'll talk about some tools that can help support you as a teacher and help support your students.
Let's see if I can figure out this technology. Okay. So these are some really good definitions of trauma that I really like, and I got them from a presentation I went to on trauma-informed care by Jennifer Miller. She's a really great mental health clinician. So those are just for you to read through. I don't want to read them off the slide. But it's really important to remember that trauma affects people at the cellular level. It can actually change the way the brain and body respond to certain stimuli. So what is traumatic to young children? A lot of times we think of the big ones. I don't really believe when people say trauma with a big T or trauma with a little t. I think it's however it's perceived. If it's perceived as trauma to that person, then it's traumatic. We need to remember that. So you have sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional neglect, physical or emotional neglect, domestic violence in the home, community violence, which is huge in New Orleans, sadly. Natural disasters, that's one that really stands out to Chelsea and I because of Hurricane Katrina. So pretty much every family we work with was directly affected by Katrina. A lot of the kids now were babies or like 1 or 2 years old when Katrina hit, and so they were born into that chaos. And I think hurricane season ends November 1st. I'm not sure, but we have to remember that once hurricane season comes into place, that's something that our kids are directly affected by because it's on their mind. At any point, this could happen, and so that could be a really big trigger. If a primary caregiver has a mental illness, again, I see that so often with the generations of mental illness being passed down and never really getting the correct interventions. Losing a home or homelessness, if a child doesn't know where they're going to sleep after school, that's something that's probably going to be a little traumatic. Media violence. I don't watch that much TV, but when I turn it on, it's kind of ridiculous what they show on TV these days. Like, I think they used to bleep out and blur out and you couldn't access, but we have to remember that our kids these days and youth have access to the internet. They have access to phones with internet and TV. So they pretty much can research any type of video or anything news clip they ever want to see. And so there's nothing really that's blocked these days, and that's a little scary. Death of a primary caregiver, severe illness of self or caregiver, frequent hospitalizations or medical procedures. Foster care placements, that's a big one, disrupted placements, and attachment disruption. I started that because I wanted to talk about that a little bit. Attachment was coined by John Bowlby, who is a famous psychologist and psychiatrist, I believe. And it can be defined as the secure base from which a child moves out into the world. So healthy attachment promotes self-reliance, instills sympathy, and helpfulness to others in distress. So pretty important that we get those skills. This is when children begin to learn that people have thoughts and feelings similar and different to theirs, so we get to see that empathy coming into play. And this is also when they become in sync with their environment. If their environment's really chaotic and traumatic, that's what they're going to become in sync with. If a child does not healthily attach to a primary caregiver, then they lack the development of self-regulation, empathy, impulse control, and self-motivation. So we can see how all of those things would be really problematic in the classroom and in a school setting. It's important to also note that our first lessons, we talk a lot about self-care in the yoga community and the mental health community. That was one of the first things that my professors talked about. But our first lessons in self-care come from how we were cared for, okay? So as we grow up, we learn to physically and emotionally take care of ourselves. If no one ever did that for us in a positive way, then it could affect how we view self-care and what that means. What does self-care mean to us? The sheet that you picked up in the beginning of our presentation is the ACEs study. How many of you have heard about this? Okay, so I see a few hands. When I found out about the ACEs study, my mind was completely blown. It stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. This quote was taken from a TED Talk done by Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris. She's pretty incredible. If you have the chance to watch that TED Talk, I highly recommend it. Nadine Burke-Harris. And it's in our sources page, so I can leave that up at the end so y'all can write it down. But this quote to me is pretty powerful. Adverse childhood experiences are the single greatest unaddressed public health threat facing our nation today. So unaddressed, like when you find out about this and then you find out there's not that much being done after the study came out, it's kind of mind-blowing. You're like, why isn't more being done? And so basically, let's see, little arrows, here we go. Everyone needs to know about it, especially if you're working with kids and you're working with kids that have experienced trauma. And, you know, I think it's just general information. You might be able to relate to it personally. I think a lot of us can, because the study revealed that one, childhood trauma is very common. And it uncovered the link between childhood trauma and chronic diseases that people develop as adults, as well as social and emotional problems. So to give you some stats from it, 17,500 adults were involved in this study. 67% had at least one ACE, and 1 in 8 had 4 or more. So the reason the score is so important, because the higher your score, the higher your risk of health, emotional, and social problems. Things such as, like, for the autoimmune diseases that can come about, like heart disease, lung cancer, diabetes, depression, all of that. And so again, just viewing this as a public health crisis, childhood trauma can equal being set up for a lifetime of issues if the child is not given the proper intervention. I'm not saying that it can't be reversed. It'll definitely be a part of who they are, but they don't have to identify themselves by that trauma. They can start to get help by yoga and mindfulness and all those things.
Just bringing this back, so Chloe and I live in New Orleans, and for our students that we work with, it's different, you know, in every demographic, but our studies, recently the Institute of Women's and Ethnic Studies came out with some research done in New Orleans charter schools, and it revealed that 89% of students aged 16 and under had experienced one or more adverse childhood experience by the age of 16. So it's happening in New Orleans at 4 times the rate of the national average. And if you go into communities that are high levels of poverty, you'll see something similar. New Orleans happens to be like one of the extreme cases. There's also a study done in Washington, but it's something that's really, really prevalent and what we're working with, and we're also seeing it at a much higher incident rate.
The last little bullet point was how can we start educating and doing something about it? So just keep that in mind as you go throughout your daily life and your skills and your lessons, and how can we start to be more aware of the ACEs study and start to understand it better and its implications, because it's a really powerful study.
Let's actually make this a little interactive and do a turn and talk. Let's take 1 minute, turn to the person sitting to your left or right, and brainstorm some ideas of how you can start doing this in your daily teaching, in your daily practice, whatever career path you're in. How can you start educating and doing something about what you've learned about the adverse childhood experiences? 1 minute. Go for it.
Yeah. I know. And they All right, are we on? I don't know if it's working. I don't think so.
I don't know.
Was it working?
Microphone.
Jimmy? No, I don't think it's working at all there. All right. You know what? I think my voice is probably going to be a bit fast. This is just going to be a pain.
Testing.
You have this here. Should you have it?
Now this is working. Yeah. All right, let's bring it back together in 3, pulling out my teacher voice, in 2, 1, 0. All right, let's come back. Hopefully you had some good conversation around that, and we're happy to discuss it some more after this is over. Handing it back over to Chloe.
So now a few slides on the brain development, which is important to understand when we're talking about developmental trauma. I don't know if there's somebody else's presentation coming in on this mic. Okay, we'll just keep going until something happens. But the brain develops from the bottom up. So in the womb, the reptilian brain is formed, and that's at the brain stem. And so when a child is born, a newborn, this is what is responsible for all things that newborns can do. Eat, sleep, wake up, cry, breathe, feel temperature, hunger, wetness, pain, all of those things. So that's why a newborn can do those things. The limbic system is next, and it begins to develop right after the child is born. So this is the seat of our emotions. It's the monitor of danger, which is really important that it's formed correctly because it keeps us safe. Judge of what's pleasurable or scary. Survival essentials. I bolded that because that's really important. It's also the center for which we cope with the challenges of living within our social networks. So that's pretty big. The limbic system is shaped in response to our experiences. So together, the reptilian brain and the limbic system make up our emotional brain, which is so much of what's happening with kids right now. They're learning what their emotions are, how to recognize them, how to process them. It's important also, most of y'all probably know this, but children's brains develop 90% by the age of 5. So that's why they're taking in so much information and learning so much and able to absorb. So the key task of the emotional brain is to look out for our welfare. And then there's that line, neurons that fire together, wire together. In a very simple way, this is how our brain communicates. And so our brain cells fire frequently, and the more that's fired, the stronger those connections become. And then sooner or later, those things will become automatic. So automatic responses is why that happens. And the neural network is formed by the communication, and it helps us learn, store, and recall information. So that's where memories come in. So traumatic memories. Children that experience trauma at a younger age, it actually could affect them more deeply, even if they don't remember it. Does that make sense? Because their brain's forming at such a rapid pace. So brain development and trauma, leading into that, if a child experiences a trauma such as repeated abuse, then these neurons are constantly triggered. It actually causes a chemical change in the brain. So an example is the increases in stress hormones, and Chelsea's going to talk a little bit about this more later. But if a child is constantly struggling and in a stressed out mode, then they cannot regulate their emotions and they cannot calm themselves down. I mean, that's really wild to think about that. So the brain will remain at a high alert. And so a good example of how to explain this is the fight or flight response, which, again, you've all probably heard about. But so say you're on a hike in the woods and a bear crosses your path, and you're like, oh God. You start to have that, your heart is beating, you might start sweating, and you think about, what am I going to do? Like, am I going to run? How do I protect myself? But eventually the bear goes and your body calms back down, right? Like, all right, we're good. We do some deep breathing. A child or anyone that's experienced repeated trauma or has been in traumatic situations their body does not reach that baseline level. So their body stays at that high stress state. And it's important to know that as humans, we are only set to be under extreme stress for 15 to 20 minutes before a breakdown occurs. So think if you were in that position where you were always up here. Like, that would be exhausting, right? And if you didn't understand why, because it was of these experiences that you had when you were a child. And so we have to remember that a lot of times that's what's going on with the youth we work with, okay? Also, trauma inhibits proper development of the prefrontal cortex. This is responsible for impulse control, decision-making, planning, and moderating social behavior. So again, we see why as they get into the adolescent years, the brain doesn't actually fully develop until age like 24 or 25. So as they get to be adolescents and they don't have that proper development of the prefrontal cortex. Okay. I feel so bad if y'all can't hear me. Like, I can yell. Yeah. So chaotic and, right now. I don't know as long as y'all can still hear me, and I'm seeing like some head shakes. And if you can't, then move up. Okay, we have tons of open seats up front. And so again, what I was saying is the prefrontal cortex won't properly develop. And so these teenagers are experiencing these problems. This is also huge because it's a lot of times misdiagnosed as ADHD, which we are a society of over-medicating and over-diagnosing. And we forget that the reason that they would be acting like that is because of all these things they experience with their family, and maybe this has been going on for generations. And so you really have to take into consideration the population you're working with. Okay, moving on. This is just a little visual of the lobes, and there's little, descriptions of everything. I'm a very visual person, so I wanted to add in some of those. And the next visual is, I think, really important. So I talked a lot about how trauma affects brain development. This is a visual of it. So typically, we have cognition being the most important, moving down to survival. In a child that's experienced trauma, that's in their brain developing at a rapid pace, survival is the biggest thing. And survival, usually it's attachment trumps everything. That is most important. In this situation, it's survival, because these children are not getting their needs met when they cry and they're expecting to be cuddled or fed. They aren't getting those responses. So they learn that they have to fend for themselves pretty much. So I just wanted to give the visual of the two triangles because I think it's pretty powerful to understand what's going on. Moving to Chelsea.
Awesome. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about how this is relevant in a classroom. Does anybody have any experience with working with a trauma-informed school? Okay, great. So this is a growing practice throughout school systems. I think in New Orleans we have 5 schools that are part of the trauma-informed initiative. So it comes from the umbrella organization of SAMHSA, and this is their definition of a trauma-informed program. So it's an organization that recognizes and realizes the widespread impact of trauma, and not just the impact it has on the individual, but also the people around them. And it supports students and their families and schools through their different ways of fully integrating what we know about trauma and how we can prevent it from happening again. So it's coming from a point of awareness that these experiences are going on, and we try to support them the best that we can and prevent them to happen further. So obviously, Chloe spoke a lot to what is going on in the brain, which has pretty big implications in the classroom. So right here I have a great diagram. Daniel Siegel, who wrote The Whole Brain Child, and his most recent book, Brainstorm, speaks about the brain in 2 different levels. So we have our downstairs brain, your reptilian brain, which is breathing, fight or flight mode, and then the upstairs brain, which is your higher level cognition. So thinking, body control, play, and empathy. Pretty much everything you need in the classroom to be a successful student, yes? So trauma can adversely affect attention, memory, and cognition. It reduces a child's ability to focus and process information. And then it interferes with effective problem solving or planning, and can result in overwhelming feelings of frustration and anxiety. So our students who have been experiencing these high levels of recurring trauma are stuck in the green part of their brain. They're in the downstairs brain, and it's very challenging for them to complete those higher level skills because of this. Students who have experienced trauma have a higher rate of school absences. They have an increased dropout rate. They have higher levels of suspension and expulsion, and then decreased reading ability. Again, they're not able to form those connections to the upstairs brain to complete that higher level functioning. And then they also typically have a lower GPA. So pretty severe implications in the classroom when they're not supported. Trauma is the second most powerful predictor of academic failure behind SPED placement. I think that's a pretty powerful thing to recognize, mostly because it's something that we can support our students with and give them these skills within the classroom. Yeah. Special education. So students who are placed in special education classes are more likely to have academic failure or have it as a predictor, and then trauma is the second most powerful. That came from, it's in our sources page. I'll send it to you. Yeah. Yeah. So fight or flight. Chloe went over this. So our students who have experienced trauma experience triggers, and their triggers become a lot more sensitive. They're hypersensitive to other things like the sound of the bell. Transitioning from lunch to recess is really challenging. Something changes in the classroom. They don't like it. That is going to send them right into fight or flight mode and continue the stress feedback loop. They don't have that moment where they can slow down and recognize and be like, oh, hey, this is okay. It's just the school bell. But it sends them right back into that constant fight or flight mode, and the stress feedback loop continues. So this results in some different classroom behavior. How many of you have seen aggressive behavior in your classroom? How many of you have seen that when you ask somebody to pick up a pencil, or that when you ask them to do something very simple? So it's not about you. It's not what you're asking. That's their reaction. So students experience physical symptoms like headaches and stomach aches. I can't tell you how many times I have kids ask, can I go get an ice pack? I have a headache. My stomach hurts. I want to go home. Students also have poor control of emotions. That's this. That's throwing their desk. That is lashing out at somebody across the room that asked to borrow a crayon. They have unpredictable and impulsive behavior, over or under reacting. And underreacting is an interesting one. So you have this student and you say something and they don't do anything. That's it. So sometimes we overlook that. We just think that they're disengaged, but that's actually a sign of experiencing trauma. Thinking others are violating their personal space. Their triggers are sensitive. They are sensitive to what they have control over. So if they think somebody's trying to take that away from them, they're going to overreact. They're very protective of their safety. They're very protective of what they feel is theirs because that's what they have control over. And then blowing up when being corrected or told by an authority figure of what to do. I had a kid the other day that went around and ripped everything off my walls when I asked him to pick up his pencil. But that's okay. That's his reaction, and that was his way of coping, and that's something that we have to recognize is not him being a jerk. It's his way of, it's his coping skill. That's how he understands how to deal with things. Yeah.
About the authority figure being corrected or being told and acting out, what I see in, like I talked about my job outside of Project Peaceful Warriors, is a teacher would tell them to do something, they act out, the teacher sends them out, and they actually are getting arrested for this type of behavior, at least in Jefferson Parish, seeing that all the time. So that's where our restorative circles come in. We're like, excuse me, how did you not, like, how did that even happen? Like, why are you in my office right now? So again, like, we can start to see the extreme levels of teachers or, you know, people in school who don't understand this, and then it leads to the child actually getting arrested for acting out.
Okay, so we have the behaviors in the classroom. We know how trauma affects learning. Why do we turn to yoga and mindfulness? So there was a study done, and it showed that students who had been hospitalized with a diagnosis of depression, who were then given treatments of yoga, mindfulness, and meditation, and it had a positive effect on anxiety, anxious behavior, and cortisol levels, lowering down their stress output, and then an indirect effect on the cardiorespiratory health of children. And more they're coming out with research specifically around yoga and trauma for children. There's been a lot done out of the Justice Resource Institute in Massachusetts on adults and PTSD, and now we're starting to look more into its implications in children. So why yoga and mindfulness in the classroom? Trauma-informed yoga and mindfulness is a bottom-up approach. So we're meeting our students where they are. We're not taking this idea and saying this is what you have to learn and how you have to learn it. It's more like approaching our students from where they are and supporting them, getting to know them, and understanding the underlying problem underneath so that then we can give them the tools that can help them. Yoga and mindfulness also supports brain-based learning and social-emotional learning, which are two skills that students that have experienced trauma typically lack or have a harder time developing. And then also, it helps teachers. It gives you accessible tools that you can use in any moment to implement when you need them. It's pretty simple to breathe. You don't have to stop everything in the middle of your classroom to take a few deep breaths. For stress and anxiety specifically. So we'll go over some specific things that yoga and mindfulness support and then some tools to help support those things. So studies suggest yoga helps to relieve stress and anxiety in children, and then relaxation plus movement triggers a stronger relaxation response. So that means decreasing heart rate, decreasing blood pressure, breathing, and muscular tension. A lot of students who've experienced trauma experience stress in their bodies. If you notice, they'll be tighter, they're less flexible, they have their shoulders up towards their ears. So a combination of the two is really powerful. Physical activity also promotes cellular repair, and that helps to modulate regulatory neurotransmitters to interrupt the stress feedback loop. And I have a quick video to show you. I have some examples from some of my students. Yeah, I have it pulled up. How do I get out of here, though? Okay. So this is one of my second graders.
Nice and warm and get away my pressure, and a light makes me think and my heart.
So she's saying yoga helps to take away her pressure and helps her to think with her head and her heart rather than make sure that this doesn't go. Yeah. He's one of my favorites. Okay. Okay. All right. And then self-regulation. So self-regulation is big in the world of social emotional learning, and it helps our students to regulate their emotions and then their actions afterwards. So recent research demonstrates that students who voluntarily regulate their emotions, so that means they take a step back for themselves to notice who and how they're being and create a regulation response, have greater activation in their prefrontal cortex. So we know that our students who have experienced trauma aren't necessarily making those connections. So if we teach them these skills about how to pause before taking a reaction, we're helping them rebuild those connections from the downstairs brain back to the upstairs brain so that they can then not only be successful regulating their emotions, but also in learning and their time in the classroom. So a stronger upstairs brain has better regulation over the actions of the downstairs brain and control over self-regulation. I have another coping skills. All right. So this is one of my high school students that I've been working with for about 2 months since the beginning of school. And this is at an alternative high school where most of my students have either been incarcerated, dropped out of school previously, or been expelled from a prior educational institution.
I like yoga because it helps me find better coping skills like meditation and doing tree poses, and it helps me relax. Like when I'm mad, I could just come to yoga and go woosah.
How do I get out of here? So she's great. She's someone who has not had a steady attachment person. She doesn't live with her mom. She lives with another family. And it's been great to watch her grow over these past couple months just to see how short of a time it takes for this to have an impact is pretty awesome. Also, her other teachers have appreciated it. She's had far less issues in her other classes, which has been great too. So yoga also helps our students with self-awareness, which simply put is who and how we're being at any moment. And we promote this through giving the students the opportunity to slow down. So a lot of times in schools now, students don't have any time to themselves. They don't have any time. A lot of schools, raise your hand if your school has recess. That's pretty good. Raise your hand if your kids have PE every day. Yeah. So they're not having this time to slow down and take care of themselves. They go from one thing right to the next, and that can be really hard. So teaching them, giving them this time to create self-awareness, to understand how they feel and why they feel that way is really powerful. Increasing self-awareness also strengthens the prefrontal cortex and its ability to regulate emotions. So this is strengthening. This is kind of like the stepping stone to self-regulation. You have to move from self-awareness, understanding who you're being, to how you want to be, and that's the self-regulation piece. Two more videos. Inspire others. So this is a 5th grader who did yoga for about, was like 4 months in. And this also is an example of how yoga can promote social awareness.
Yoga, when I do yoga, it makes me feel like I'm on a different planet, and it makes me have a good attitude. So when you have a good attitude, you can also inspire others.
Pretty cool, huh? He's so cute. I don't want to get rid of him. There we go. Okay, but I have to close out of it. And then yoga and learning. So because children are subject to sensory overload, like we just talked about, and adults are as well, the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight, is usually activated more than the parasympathetic nervous system. So that creates stress. Yoga helps to activate the parasympathetic nervous system, so that reduces stress and increases the ability to focus and to learn. And then this is one of my absolute favorites. Also a 5th grader, extremely bright. A great example of a student who is having a difficult time learning just because of focus issues.
Yoga makes me feel relaxed and more smarter, because every day after relaxation I go to science and I could finish everything faster because my mind is cleared and I'm back on track to doing what I have to do. And then I like yoga because when you're doing all these poses, it signifies things, and some of the yoga poses are difficult, and I like difficult things. So, awesome.
So he goes a little bit deeper there beyond just learning, which is great.
Yoga makes me feel relaxed.
He's a spectacular little yogi. So those are some great examples of how yoga has impacted students. This is a great quote. It's from an article in the New York Times. And it says, the practice of yoga specifically around meditation, breathing techniques, posture, exercises, and deep relaxations helps kids learn strategies to cope more effectively with stress and emotion. They become more stress hardy and resilient. They become more emotionally stable and less reactive, which is important for kids, particularly teens who are going through enormous changes. Improving their stress response prevents them from developing chronic stress, which is a major factor for psychological conditions such as depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and these are all major problems for kids as well as adults. It's essential that they learn how to calm down and self-regulate their inner state.
The teens with enormous changes. I work with a lot of teenagers, obviously, and you think about, like, if you were dealing with this and then also going through puberty, like puberty was traumatizing as it was, like, as you know, we all had to go through that. So just think about that too. Like they have so much going at them at one time, and the back part of their brain is developing so fast, and the front part that deals with like making good decisions, and that part of the brain that's like, maybe I shouldn't do that, it's not caught up yet. And so a lot of what we teach our parents that I work with is adolescent brain development, and they're like, oh, that's what's going on. So, I mean, we have taken all these things in consideration. Like, our youth have it pretty hard. Like, it's hard to be a teenager these days.
Absolutely. And one other quick thing on this. This is just a fun little exercise. Who knows what the size of the brain is? Yeah. So. That it's the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, but they can understand that that is what's going on. So we'll move into some tools now to support our students. And a lot of people ask, how is teaching trauma-informed yoga different than teaching regular yoga, or how is that different? And I think that the most important thing is that you're teaching with awareness and acceptance. So you are not coming to ask these students what happened. You are not coming to solve a problem for them. You're not coming to fix them or change them. You're simply supporting them with tools that they can use. It's not our job to tell them how they should be. It's not our job to tell them what happened was wrong. It's simply our job to give them tools to cope and to work through things. So the easiest and most accessible tool that you can teach your students is breathing. We breathe to stay alive. Conscious breathing brings us into balance and awareness of ourselves. And then it also gives us the opportunity to slow down and to center, which just as it's important for students, it's also important for teachers to take this time to breathe too. So sometimes I have to take a take 5 with my students, and I'm like, this is for me, guys, but I need you to do it with me too. So this is a picture of breathing with straws. If you've ever done that, you can set up an obstacle course and have students use a straw in like a pom-pom, or if you're feeling super nice, you can do an M&M or a Skittle. And they love that, and set up a maze. You can also print out a maze and put it on a piece of paper, which is great. But we'll take a second to do some breathing here. So 1, 2, 3 breathing or counting breath. If you've ever done something like this, raise your hand. Okay, cool. So let's try it just for a second. I like to use my 3 fingers. And why don't we all sit up straight, feet on the ground. And I've seen some students that like to do it like this. For me, that's actually kind of hard. It's a fine motor skill, which is great to teach. But you can also do it like this. And the point is to slow down your breathing from the count of like a normal heightened rate to a 3 count. And you can do anything from a 3 to a 5. Sometimes students that have experienced more trauma don't like to hold their breath for as long, which is totally okay. So I start with 3 count always, and I take my right palm out, and you have the option to close your eyes if that makes you feel safe. And as you breathe in, you'll count on your fingers, first touching your thumb and your pointer finger, middle finger, and then your ring finger. So eyes closed. Let's breathe in for the count of 1, 2, 3. Hold right here for 3, 2, 1. And then we'll breathe out for 1, 2, 3. And then hold at the bottom just for 3, 2, 1. So you can do that 3 to 5 times. It's a great way to get students recentered, especially if you have fidgety students that need to move something. They have their fingers that they can move. The second one is sounding breath, which is kind of like a seashell breath, if you've done that before with your hands over your ears. So this gives students an opportunity to really experience how breath is working in their body and how it sounds. So I'm going to put this down for a second. You're going to take some headphones with your hands, depending on the age group that you're working with. The other day I saw them red. So you take your headphones over your ears. Nothing. But it's a great exercise, especially if your classroom is super loud, there's a lot going on. It's a great way to kind of bring things back together. And then belly breathing. So having students have the awareness of their anatomy is really important too, because then they can understand what's going on in their body as they're breathing. Belly breath. Students that have experienced trauma have a hard time recognizing that, or it takes a little bit longer. And then the Hoberman sphere, but we're actually going to move on. So another tool is physical movement. Physical activity promotes cellular repair, which interrupts the stress feedback loop. Movement builds brain cells and supports the optimal functioning of every system in the body. So important. And studies have shown that students that exercised for 15 minutes a day, whether that was yoga or PE, just 15 minutes, they saw an increase in positive emotions and a decrease in negative emotions. So a great way to bring movement into your classroom if you don't have a lot of time or space is chair poses. They're really accessible for students of all abilities, all shapes, all sizes. So let's do an everybody come to the edge of your seats, and we'll integrate some breathing here too. So if you'll sit just flat on the edge of the floor. And this isn't a ton of movement, but it does start to get the arms and your breathing going. So make interlace your hands right here. Okay. So as we breathe in, we'll pull our palms up towards our chin. And as we breathe out, we'll push them away. Good. Breathe in, reach your arms up. Good. Breathe out. Down. Let's do that 2 more times. Breathe in. Breathe out. Breathe in. Breathe out. And if you have a tighter space, we'll just take our hands down to our knees and try that. Breathe in. Breathe out. Breathe in. Good. Hands to that side. So it gets a little bit of blood flow going. It keeps that same sensation of breathing and interconnection.
do this super quick. Everyone's heard of the glitter mind jar, one of my personal favorites. But we kind of ran out, I think, in the beginning, but I did copy it on a sheet for you all. But basically, again, like I've said, I'm a very visual person. So all the glitter in the jar and the confetti and the beads represent our thoughts and emotions. Does anyone know how many thoughts and emotions we can experience in one day? Yeah, 60,000. Whenever I tell my kids that, they're like, what? Oh my goodness, they're like 100. So we do the shaken versus settled. And I also show the Just Breathe video that most of you probably heard about, but we're not gonna have time to show it. The reason for the seashell on the slide is the mindful touching and feeling. So everyone loves to fiddle with things, youth, adults, all of us. And so this is a really good activity that allows children to do that mindfully. Again, I made a copy of it, and both of those activities came from a book that's 50 mindfulness techniques for children and teens. It's a really great resource. I use it all the time. My teacher friends use it. It's something that you should probably just have on your shelf anyways. Oh, and just the sharp objects. Make sure you go through with your own hands and feel those, because that can get, mixed up sometimes.
Okay, and we won't go through all of this just because we only have, I think, 2 minutes left. But students who have experienced trauma are in constant overstimulation, so relaxation allows them to take a break, recharge, and tune into themselves. It's also something very challenging for them to do. So it's most definitely a process in teaching them this, because most of them do not know how to relax their bodies. One of my favorite exercises to use with these students for relaxation is tense and release. If you know the tense and release, where you focus on tensing up different body parts, one at a time, two at a time, and then having them recognize how their body part felt while it was tense and how it felt after. I think that's one of the most powerful things that you can teach them, and that's the most effective exercise for them to do when you're first getting started with relaxation. As far as like a guided visualization goes, sometimes with trauma, guided visualization can be triggering. So it's important to keep as much student autonomy in this as possible. So sticking with things like imagine the color that makes you feel happy, imagining your safe place, something where you are not giving the directive, but you're empowering the student to create it themselves is going to be much more effective. And I believe we have about 1 minute for any questions. And we will leave sources page up afterwards. And then this is also our contact information. But if you want to spend about a minute asking if anybody has any questions, we're also happy to talk to you afterwards. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Yeah, that's teaching empathy, which is a social skill. But the most important thing for you as a teacher is to make sure that you're addressing the needs of the trauma-informed, students that need the extra support, and the other students are usually willing to adapt. So it's not saying that it's okay that your friend, our friend over here is flipping out. This is something that happens. We know he needs a space, but I think that it's important to also acknowledge the student that is having that experience, also in a positive way. So giving them, say, you did this, but this time you learned how to breathe, so that's great. And teaching other students, they're like, you can celebrate that together. Yeah. Yeah, it just takes time. Yeah, and persistence, and also establishing a really great relationship with them. So if they're like, no, we're not doing yoga today, I don't want to do this, forget it, I'm not doing anything you say, that's fine. Have a conversation with them instead, see what happens. Wrap it up. Okay, one more question if anybody has one. Yeah. Sure. That's why I said keep it to like 3 counts, keeping it something slower and not doing it for an extended period of time. I think taking 3 deep breaths is great for them. It's a great starting point. A lot of them do say that they feel nervous if they have to hold their breath. They say that they feel dizzy when they breathe a lot. So that also comes with time and practice also, and just modifying to what they need. And it's going to be different for different students with different experiences. Okay, that's it. Thank you guys so much. And please don't hesitate to email us if you have any questions.